She didn't weep when her father pushed her forward like a debt being settled. She didn't flinch when her sisters laughed behind their fans. Amelia Whittaker simply picked up her small worn bag, lifted her chin, and walked out the door of the only home she'd ever known. Alone, unwanted, and unafraid. What her family never imagined was that the coldest man in all of Virginia had not chosen her out of pity. He had chosen her because she was the only real thing in a room full of performances. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Amelia Whittaker's life changed forever. She was elbow deep in the kitchen garden, pulling up the last of the summer squash, when her younger sister came running across the yard. "Amelia," Clara's voice cut through the heavy Virginia air. "Papa wants us all in the parlor. Now, a man is coming." Amelia straightened slowly, wiping her hands against her apron. "What kind of man?" Clara's eyes were bright in the way they only got when something important was about to happen to someone else. "Jonathan Caldwell." The name landed like a stone in still water. Amelia had heard the name spoken in hushed tones at every gathering she'd attended in the last 3 years. Jonathan Caldwell of Caldwell Ridge. 36 years old. Widower. Owner of the largest privately held estate in 3 counties. Rich enough to buy the whole of their county twice over if he felt like it. Cold enough, people said, that his first wife had wept herself thin in that big house before God finally took mercy on her. That last part was gossip. Amelia didn't put much stock in gossip. She removed her apron, tucked a loose strand of dark brown hair behind her ear, and followed her sister inside. The parlor of the Whittaker household had been arranged with the kind of care that made Amelia's stomach sink the moment she stepped through the door. The good settee had been pulled out. Her mother had set fresh flowers in the vase on the mantel, flowers she'd made Amelia cut and arrange the previous afternoon without explaining why. Her 2 older sisters, Harriet and Charlotte, were already seated, both of them dressed in their finest. Harriet wore her blue silk. Charlotte had on the cream muslin that their mother always said brought out her eyes. Amelia was wearing a day dress the color of dishwater. She had not been told to change. Her father, Thomas Whittaker, stood near the window with the stiffness of a man carrying a weight he didn't want anyone to see. He was not an unkind man by nature. He was, however, a desperate one. And desperate men, Amelia had learned, did things that kind men would not. "Sit down," he said when he saw her. He didn't quite meet her eyes. She sat. Her mother, seated near the window with her embroidery that she never actually worked on, gave Amelia a brief look up and down, and then looked away again. Not cruelly. Simply with the reflexive inattention of a woman who had spent 25 years looking at her youngest daughter and seeing someone who didn't require much consideration. They waited. Harriet leaned over to Charlotte and whispered something behind her hand. Charlotte smiled. Neither of them looked at Amelia. Then the knock came at the front door, and everything in the room seemed to pull tighter. Jonathan Caldwell was not what Amelia expected. She had pictured the rumors made flesh. A large man, perhaps, with cold eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his comfort. What walked through the parlor door was something more complicated than that. He was tall, yes. His shoulders carried themselves with the kind of ease that came not from arrogance, but from a man who had spent decades not needing to perform for anyone. His face was weathered in a way that Virginia sun and Virginia trouble both contributed to equally. His eyes were the color of a sky an hour before a storm. Not dark exactly, but not light either. Watchful, unhurried. He did not smile when he entered the room. He didn't appear to be the kind of man who smiled as a greeting. "Mr. Whittaker." His voice was even. Not warm, not cold. Simply direct, the way a man spoke when he'd learned long ago that courtesy and clarity were not the same thing. "Mr. Caldwell." Her father shook his hand with both of his own, and something in that gesture, the eagerness of it, the slight desperation, made Amelia look down at her hands in her lap. She already knew, in the way that youngest daughters who have spent a lifetime reading rooms know things, exactly what was happening. Her father owed Jonathan Caldwell money, not a small amount. She had pieced it together over the past months from fragments she was never meant to overhear. Her father's voice through the study door, low and tight with anxiety. A letter her mother had cried over and then burned. Numbers written in the household ledger that didn't add up no matter how many times Amelia ran them. The Whittaker estate was failing. Had been failing for 3 years, since a bad harvest followed by a worse investment, followed by a loan taken out at terms that only made sense if you believed the next year would turn everything around. The next year had not turned anything around. Jonathan Caldwell held the note on that loan. He also, apparently, needed a wife. Not for love. Amelia understood that much without being told. Jonathan Caldwell was not the kind of man who came to a parlor full of uncertain daughters looking for love. He was the kind of man who identified a problem and located a practical solution. His estate was large. His household was unmanaged. He had a son. She'd heard that too, a boy of 11 or 12. And no woman to run the domestic affairs of Caldwell Ridge. Was, in the plainest possible terms, looking to make an arrangement. And her father was offering him one. "My daughters," Thomas Whittaker said, gesturing broadly as though presenting something at auction. Jonathan Caldwell's gaze moved across the room. It paused on Harriet, who sat up straighter and touched the lace at her collar. It moved to Charlotte, who let her lips part in what she clearly hoped was an inviting smile. Then it moved to Amelia, who was watching him with the same steady attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. Their eyes met. He looked at her for a moment longer than he'd looked at the others. Then he looked back at her father. "I'll want to speak with them," he said. It was Harriet who went first. Amelia listened from the hallway. Not deliberately eavesdropping, but because the parlor door had been left an inch ajar, and she wasn't entirely sure she was supposed to leave. She could hear her sister's voice rising and falling in the musical way Harriet deployed when she wanted to impress someone. Harriet was good at that. She had always been good at performing warmth, performing interest, performing exactly the version of herself that a given room seemed to want. She could not, however, have told Jonathan Caldwell what crop rotation schedule was most efficient for red Virginia clay soil, or why the south-facing fields at Whittaker Land had underperformed for the past 2 seasons, or what 3 changes to a household ledger would cut unnecessary expenditure without reducing the quality of life for anyone who lived there. Amelia could have told him all of those things. Nobody had ever asked her to. Charlotte went next. Her interview lasted slightly longer. Amelia heard laughter, Charlotte's bright, practiced laugh, and then a pause, and then Jonathan Caldwell's voice, asking something she couldn't quite make out. Then Charlotte's voice again, higher this time, less certain. Then the door opened, and Charlotte came out wearing an expression that she was working hard to smooth over. "Your turn," she said to Amelia. And then, almost involuntarily, she looked Amelia up and down. The dishwater dress, the plain hair, the absence of any particular effort. Something flickered across Charlotte's face that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite relief. Amelia walked into the parlor. Jonathan Caldwell was standing near the window when she entered, not seated the way the room was clearly arranged for him to be. He had the look of a man who preferred to observe from a standing position. Amelia sat down in a chair across from the settee. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "You're the youngest," he said. "Yes." "Amelia." "Yes." He studied her for a moment. "You weren't told to dress for this." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "No, sir." "Why not?" She considered lying. "It would have been easy enough. I didn't have time. I wasn't feeling well. I misunderstood the occasion." Instead, she said, "I don't believe my family expected you to choose me." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly. More like the slight recalibration of a man who'd expected one thing and encountered another. "What do you know about running a household?" he asked. "More than most women my age," she said. "I've managed the accounts at Whittaker for 3 years, the kitchen schedule, the harvest planning. I know how to read a ledger, and I know how to find where money is going that shouldn't be going there." She paused. I also know when a piece of land is being mismanaged and approximately how long it takes before the damage becomes irreversible. Do you? His voice gave nothing away. Our south field, she said. We lost 30% yield last season because the drainage ditch was cut in the wrong place. I told my father in the spring of 1815. He thanked me and didn't change anything. She folded her hands in her lap. I would not make that same mistake on someone else's land. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she became aware of the sounds from outside the room. Her mother's voice, low and anxious, somewhere down the hallway. The faint sound of Harriet and Charlotte talking. Then Jonathan Caldwell said, "What do you want, Miss Whitaker?" She blinked. In her entire life, she could not remember a man asking her that question. I beg your pardon? You heard me. She thought about it honestly. I want to be useful, she said at last. I want to be somewhere that what I know actually matters. I want... She stopped. Go on. I want to not spend the rest of my life in a house where I'm furniture. Something in his face changed again. She couldn't name it. She wasn't sure she was meant to. I'll speak to your father, he said. She found out she'd been chosen the same way she'd found out she was being offered in the first place. Not directly, not with any particular ceremony, but by standing in a hallway and overhearing a conversation she was supposed to be too unimportant to listen to. Her father's voice, relieved in a way that was almost painful to hear. I'm glad you saw something in her, Mr. Caldwell. She's a good girl, quiet, won't cause trouble. And Jonathan Caldwell's voice, even and unreadable as ever. I chose her for her mind, Mr. Whitaker, not her temperament. A pause. Then her father. Yes, well, of course. Her sister's reactions were not what she'd expected. Harriet was silent for a long moment when their mother told them. Then she said, very quietly, he chose Amelia. And the way she said it made the words sound less like a fact and more like a question she didn't understand the answer to. Charlotte said, I suppose he pitied her. And she said it in the tone of someone who needed that to be true. Their mother did not correct either of them. Their mother came to Amelia's room that night, while she was beginning to pack the few things she'd take with her, and stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. He seems like a decent man, she finally said. Serious, but decent. Yes, ma'am. You'll write to us. Of course. Her mother lingered a moment longer. Then she said, in a softer voice than usual, I know we haven't always... She stopped, started again. You've always been the capable one, Amelia. I hope that serves you well there. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she had ever received. Thank you, Mama, she said. Her mother nodded once and left. Amelia folded her last dress into the bag, set 2 books on top of it, and sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet. She did not cry. She'd done her crying years ago, in small amounts, in private, for all the ordinary moments that made up a lifetime of being overlooked. She was done with that. What she felt now was something she didn't entirely have a name for. Not happiness, not fear. Something closer to the feeling she got in the moment before a storm broke, when the air had gone still and strange, and you understood, with your whole body, that the world was about to become something different than it was. She was ready for different. The morning she left, her father shook her hand at the door. Not embraced her. Shook her hand, the way you'd conclude a transaction with someone you'd done reasonable business with. You'll be well taken care of, he said. She thought about pointing out that she had not, in fact, been particularly well taken care of by him. She thought about asking him how he could stand there with that expression of strained relief on his face and not feel the weight of what he was doing. She thought about a great many things. Instead, she said, "Yes, sir," and picked up her bag. Harriet watched from the top of the stairs. She did not come down. Charlotte was in the garden and did not come in at all. The carriage that Jonathan Caldwell had sent for her was waiting at the gate. It was plain, well-maintained, and had a driver who tipped his hat when she approached. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Good morning," she said. She got in without looking back. The road to Caldwell Ridge took the better part of a morning. Amelia spent most of it with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the Virginia countryside moving past, trying to inventory everything she knew about where she was going. Jonathan Caldwell. Widower. 11 years. Possibly 12. Son. No other children that anyone had mentioned. Estate reputed to be one of the finest in the county, though lately, she'd caught fragments of this too. There were murmurs that Caldwell Ridge wasn't running as smoothly as it once had. An overseer who'd left under uncertain circumstances. Accounts that weren't being managed correctly. Crops that were underperforming. She filed these things away in the orderly part of her mind where she kept practical information. She was not going to Caldwell Ridge to be decorative. She was going to be useful. And God help her, she intended to be. The first thing she noticed when the carriage turned through the gate at Caldwell Ridge was that the fence line on the east side hadn't been repaired in at least one full season. 2 rails down, 1 post leaning at the kind of angle that would have it flat on the ground before winter. The second thing she noticed was that the kitchen garden, visible from the drive, had been laid out with ambition and maintained with neglect. The bones of it were good. Whoever had designed it had known what they were doing. But the weeds had been left too long, and the beds were beginning to crowd each other in ways that would hurt the yield. She cataloged both observations and said nothing. Jonathan Caldwell was waiting for her at the front of the house, not on the steps, beside them, standing in the way she was beginning to recognize as his default, adjacent to the expected position, slightly to one side, watching. He helped her down from the carriage himself. His hand was dry, his grip firm, and he let go the moment she had her footing. "Welcome to Caldwell Ridge, Miss Whitaker," he said. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she couldn't quite help it, "Your east fence needs attention before the season turns." He looked at her for a moment. "It does," he said. "I can take a look at the post alignment if that would be useful. Sometimes it's the posts, not the rails, and if you replace the rails without addressing the posts, you'll be doing it again in 6 months. You know fence repair." "I know what goes wrong when it isn't done properly," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "Come inside," he said. "There's someone who wants to meet you." The boy was standing in the front hall, with the particular rigid posture of a child who had been told to stand there and had taken the instruction very seriously. He was 11. She'd been right about the age, with his father's watchful eyes and a set to his jaw that suggested he'd already decided, before she'd arrived, how he felt about this situation. She had met that expression before. She'd grown up in a household full of people who'd made their decisions about her before she'd opened her mouth. She crouched down so she was at his eye level, which she could tell surprised him because his chin came up slightly in the defensive way children did when they expected to be condescended to and got something else instead. "You must be William," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Very careful. Very neutral. "I'm Amelia. I expect this is strange for you." He looked at her steadily. "Are you going to change things?" "Some things need changing," she said. "Some things are fine as they are. I won't know which is which until I understand how things work here. So before I change anything, I'll ask you." She paused. "Is that acceptable?" He thought about it with the seriousness of a child accustomed to being taken seriously by very few adults. "That's acceptable," he said finally. She straightened up and looked at Jonathan, who had been watching this exchange from 2 feet away with the expression of a man recalculating something. "Which room is the household account book kept in?" she asked him. "The study," he said. "After I'm shown to my room, I'd like to start there, if you're willing." A pause, then, "I'm willing." The study at Caldwell Ridge told her everything she needed to know about the last year of the estate's management. The account books were behind by 4 months. The ledger entries were inconsistent, 2 different handwriting styles, with a suspicious gap of about 6 weeks in the middle, where entries had been made in pencil, then erased and rewritten. Expenditures in the household column had been running 30% higher than they should for an estate this size. The figures for the Northfield harvest from the previous autumn had been recorded in a way that made the yield look better than it actually was. She sat with the books for 3 hours. When she looked up, Jonathan was in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. "Well," he said. She set her pen down. "Your last overseer was skimming from the household accounts. Not a great amount at any one time, which is why it wasn't obvious, but consistently, over the course of about 14 months. My estimate is approximately $240. She paused. "Also, your Northfield harvest last autumn was worse than what's recorded here. Whoever entered these numbers was either being optimistic or they had a reason to make things look better than they were." The silence was very complete. "You got all of that from 3 hours with the ledgers," he said. "I've been reading ledgers since I was 16, she said. "My father wasn't interested in them. Someone had to be." She looked at him steadily. "Do you want me to continue, or would you prefer to have someone else look at this?" He moved into the room and sat down across from her. "Continue," he said. Dinner that night was quiet, the three of them at the long table in the dining room. Jonathan at the head, William across from Amelia, the space of the table between them all carrying the particular weight of people figuring out what they were to each other. William ate with focus. Jonathan ate with efficiency. Amelia ate and watched both of them without being obvious about it. "The kitchen staff," she said, at a pause between courses. "How many?" "3, Jonathan said. "Mrs. Holt manages them." "I'd like to meet her tomorrow, if she's willing." "She'll be willing." A pause. "She's been here 12 years. She'll be cautious with you. She was fond of my late wife." Amelia nodded. That was information she needed. "I have no intention of making changes for the sake of making changes. Mrs. Holt knows this household. I'd rather learn from her than work around her." Jonathan looked at her. "That's a more sensible approach than most people would take," he said. "Most people in my position haven't spent years working alongside people who know more than them," she said. "I'm used to learning from whoever has the knowledge, regardless of their station." William looked up from his plate. "Papa doesn't usually eat dinner with people who talk this much," he said. It was not unkind, simply observational. "William," Jonathan said. "No, he's right," Amelia said. "I do talk more than I should. It's something I'm working on." She looked at the boy. "Does it bother you?" He considered this with the same gravity he'd brought to their earlier conversation. "Not yet," he said. She pressed her lips together against a smile. Across the table, she caught Jonathan watching her. He looked away first. Later that night, in the room she'd been given, adequate, clean, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden, she sat at the small writing desk and opened the notebook she'd brought from home. At the top of a fresh, she wrote, "Caldwell Ridge, July, 1817. Below it she began to list, in her careful, efficient handwriting, everything she'd observed in her first day. The fence, the garden, the ledger discrepancies, Mrs. Holt, William, the gap in the accounts, and at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, she added, "He listens when spoken to. He does not interrupt. When he does not know something, he does not pretend that he does." She looked at what she'd written for a moment. Then she closed the notebook, set it beside her books, and blew out the candle. Outside, the Virginia night settled over Caldwell Ridge, warm and dark and thick with the sounds of summer. Amelia lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the unfamiliar ceiling and felt, beneath the strangeness of it all, something she hadn't felt in longer than she could clearly remember. Like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't know yet what that meant, but she intended to find out. The next morning began before the household woke. Amelia had been up since 5, sitting at the small desk in her room with the copied ledger figures she'd stayed up half the night transcribing. She wasn't tired. She'd never needed much sleep, another thing her mother had considered vaguely unnatural about her. Normal women, apparently, slept soundly and rose when the sun told them to. Amelia had always been awake before the sun, thinking about problems she hadn't solved yet. She had a great many problems to think about here. When she came downstairs, the kitchen was already lit. She could hear Mrs. Holt moving behind the door, the particular rhythm of a woman who had been running a kitchen for a long time and had her sequence so well established that it ran like clockwork, even before her mind was fully engaged with the day. Amelia knocked on the kitchen door. A pause. Then, "Come." Mrs. Holt was a compact woman somewhere in her mid-50s, with flour on her hands and the expression of someone who had already made several decisions about this situation before the door opened. Her eyes moved over Amelia with the practiced speed of a woman who had survived a long time in a difficult household by reading people accurately and quickly. "Mrs. Holt," Amelia said, "I'm sorry to disturb you early. I wanted to introduce myself properly before the day got complicated. You're the new Mrs. Caldwell." "I'm Amelia Whitaker," she said. "I'm not Mrs. Caldwell yet. We haven't had the ceremony." She paused. "And even after, I'd prefer Amelia, if you're comfortable with that, at least between the two of us." Something shifted slightly in Mrs. Holt's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the very faint recalibration of a woman who had been braced for one thing and encountered something different. "What is it you want, miss?" "I want to understand how this kitchen works," Amelia said. "Not to change it, to understand it. You've run this household for 12 years. I've been here 16 hours. Any sensible person would learn before she acted." Mrs. Holt was quiet for a moment. "Sit down then," she said finally. "I'll make tea." What Amelia learned in the next hour was more useful than anything she could have read in a ledger. Mrs. Holt talked in the way that long-practiced people talked when they were finally asked the right questions. Not in a flood, but in careful, measured increments, testing how each piece of information was received before offering the next. Amelia listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, without showing on her face what she thought before she'd finished thinking it. The story that emerged was this. Caldwell Ridge had, for 12 years after Eleanor Caldwell's death, been run almost entirely by a man named Gerald Pierce. Pierce had been the estate overseer. He had also, apparently, been the kind of man who understood that a grieving widower who had no interest in the mechanics of daily life was an opportunity. "How wasn't a bad man exactly," Mrs. Holt said, which was the way people talked about bad men they'd been dependent on for too long. "He kept things running, but he kept things running his way, and his way included certain arrangements that weren't strictly proper." "The accounts," Amelia said. Mrs. Holt looked at her. "You found them already?" "Last night." A pause in which the older woman measured something. "Mr. Caldwell dismissed Pierce 4 months ago. Someone finally sent him a letter, anonymously, with enough specifics that he couldn't ignore it anymore. But Pierce left a mess. And after him, there was no one who knew how to put it right." "Who sent the letter?" Mrs. Holt's expression didn't change. "I'm sure I don't know." Amelia looked at her steadily. The older woman looked back. "I see," Amelia said. For the first time, something approaching warmth moved through Mrs. Holt's eyes. "The staff is unsettled," she said, dropping her voice slightly. "Pierce made promises to some of them that may not hold. 2 of the farmhands don't know if their arrangements are still good. And Samuel. He manages the grain storage. Samuel has been doing the work of 3 men since Pierce left because no one replaced the people Pierce let go." Amelia wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. She stored it all in the ordered part of her mind and nodded. "I'd like to meet Samuel today," she said. "And the farmhands. With your help, if you're willing. People are more willing to speak honestly if they see that someone in the household trusts who's introducing them." Mrs. Holt was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You're not what I expected." "People rarely expect me," Amelia said. "I've found it's occasionally useful." She found Jonathan Caldwell in the study at 7 in the morning, already working through his correspondence with the focused economy of a man who treated every hour like it had been allotted a specific task. He looked up when she came in. "You were in the kitchen," he said. Not a question. "With Mrs. Holt, for about an hour." She sat down across from him without being invited to, because waiting to be invited to things was a habit she was done with. "I need to talk to you about Gerald Pierce." Something in his face tightened, just slightly. "What about him?" "He didn't just skim accounts," she said. "He restructured the staffing arrangements over the past few years in ways that benefited him and left your operation understaffed in 3 critical areas. grain storage, fence and structure maintenance, and your east field rotation. When he left those gaps unfilled, which means the people who remained have been absorbing his work without any acknowledgement or adjustment to their compensation. Jonathan was looking at her with the particular stillness of a man listening to something he didn't entirely want to hear. The result, she continued, is that you have good people who feel forgotten, and men who feel forgotten either leave or stop caring. You've been lucky that Samuel is the kind of man who takes pride in his work, regardless of whether anyone's watching. But luck runs out. A silence. How do you know about Samuel? Mrs. Holt told me. Mrs. Holt doesn't talk to people she doesn't trust. I know, Amelia said. He studied her for a moment. What are you proposing? First, I'd like your permission to speak directly with the farmhands and the outdoor staff today, to hear what their situations are, and to reassure them that the arrangements Pierce promised are being reviewed, not canceled. Second, I'd like to go through the full accounts with you tonight, not the version Pierce recorded. The real numbers, which I can reconstruct from the underlying records if you can give me access to the storage receipts and the harvest tallies. She paused. Third, your east fence needs 3 new posts and about 15 feet of rail before the fall. I'd like to arrange that this week. Jonathan looked at her for what felt like a long time. You've been here less than a day, he said. I know. You're telling me things about my own estate that I didn't know. Yes. Another silence. And then quietly, without any particular weight. I should have looked more closely. It was not a thing she'd expected him to say. Most men, in her experience, when confronted with evidence that something had gone wrong on their watch, found a way to make the evidence the problem rather than the failure. He simply sat with it, without deflecting. You had other things to attend to, she said, more gently than she'd intended. His eyes came back to hers. Don't excuse it, he said. It was my estate, my responsibility. She nodded once. All right. You have my permission for all 3 things. He stood. I'll have the storage records brought to the study by this afternoon. She rose too. Thank you. She was halfway to the door when he said, Amelia. She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her given name. It landed differently than she'd expected it to. I had a meeting this morning, he said. I'll be back before supper. I'd like to hear what you find. I'll have something worth telling you, she said. Samuel turned out to be a man of about 45, built like someone who had been doing heavy work since childhood, with hands that told the whole story of his life and eyes that were carefully neutral when she introduced herself. He'd clearly been warned about her arrival. He'd also clearly decided, before she opened her mouth, not to trust it. She didn't blame him. How long have you been managing the grain storage? She asked. 7 years, he said. 6 with Pierce. 4 months without anyone to answer to. That last part sounds like it could go either way, she said. Freedom, or being left to drown. He looked at her sharply. The second one. I thought so. She clasped her hands in front of her. Mr. Pierce apparently promised you additional compensation for taking on the work his departure created. I want you to know that I'm reviewing those arrangements. I can't make you a promise today that everything will be honored exactly as he stated, because I don't know yet what he actually stated and what he implied. But I can promise you that I will find out, and that I'll tell you the truth of what I find, and that Mr. Caldwell has authorized me to address gaps in staffing and compensation. Samuel stared at her. Pierce never put anything in writing, he said, like he was expecting her to use that against him. Then we'll work from what's reasonable, she said. I can see what you've been managing by looking at the records. What a man's work is worth doesn't require his employer's honesty to be calculable. A pause, long enough that she wasn't sure he was going to respond. Then he said, the south storage bin has a moisture problem that'll ruin the winter grain if it's not addressed before October. Show me, she said. He blinked, as though the words were in the wrong order. Now? He said. You just told me something urgent. Why would I wait? He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned and walked. She followed. By afternoon, Amelia had spoken with every member of the outdoor staff. By late afternoon, she had a list of 17 specific problems, ranked in order of urgency, with notes on what each would require to resolve. She had also, without quite planning to, had 3 separate conversations that began as practical and ended as personal. Men telling her things about the estate that they'd been holding because no one had thought to ask. She was in the study, reconstructing the true account figures from the storage receipts, when William appeared in the doorway. "Papa's not home yet," he said. "I know," he said before supper. William came in and sat in the chair across from her, the one his father usually occupied. He looked at the papers spread across the desk with the focused attention of a child trying to determine if he was interested. "What are those?" "Records of what your estate has produced and spent over the past 3 years," she said. "I'm separating what actually happened from what someone wrote down." "Those are different?" "They can be. When someone wants to hide something, they change the record. But they can't change the actual grain, or the actual lumber, or the actual crop. So if you go back to the source records, the receipts, the tallies, the physical inventories, you can reconstruct the truth." William leaned forward. "Like a puzzle." "Exactly like a puzzle." He was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Pierce stole from us." She looked up. He was watching her steadily. "Yes," she said, not softening it, because he hadn't asked for it softened. "Not a huge amount at any one time, but consistently, over a long time. Papa trusted him. Your father trusted him to do his job honestly, because honest people generally assume others are honest until shown otherwise." She set her pen down. "It wasn't your father's failing that Pierce was dishonest. It's Pierce's failing." William absorbed this. Then, "Are you going to fix it?" "I'm going to try." "How long will it take? Fixing the accounts?" "A few weeks." "Fixing the staffing gaps?" "A season or 2, if Mr. Caldwell agrees to the adjustments." "Fixing the south grain bin before the moisture ruins the winter stores?" She looked at him. "That one I'm pushing for this week." The boy almost smiled. "You make lists, don't you?" "Constantly." "Papa makes lists too." "I know," she said. "I could tell from the way the study was arranged when I came in." William looked around the room with new eyes, as though trying to see what she'd seen. "How?" "Someone who makes lists puts things in order by priority, not by size or convenience. The correspondence on the right was organized chronologically, most recent on top. The ledgers on the left were grouped by year. Even the pens were arranged by frequency of use." She paused. "A person reveals a great deal in how they organize the things they work with every day." I was looking at her with an expression she recognized. The look of someone who had just realized they were in a conversation they were actually interested in. "What does my room say about me?" he asked. "I haven't seen your room," she said, "Ed. But you can tell me and I'll make an assessment," he told her. She assessed. By the time Jonathan Caldwell's horse came through the gate 20 minutes later, William was laughing at something she'd said, and neither of them had noticed the time passing. Jonathan heard his son's laugh from the hallway. He stopped just outside the study door. He could not remember the last time he'd heard William laugh like that. Not the polite, careful laugh the boy used in company, the one that was more social acknowledgement than genuine amusement. This was different. This was the laugh of a child who'd been caught off guard by something that was actually funny. He stood in the hallway for a moment without going in. Then he pushed the door open. Amelia looked up from the papers. William straightened in the chair with the reflexive composure of a boy who had spent too much time in the company of adults who expected it. "You're back," William said. "I am." Jonathan looked between them. Something had shifted in the room. The air of it. The particular quality of 2 people who had spent time together and arrived at something. "What's amusing?" "Amelia says I arrange my books to make it look like I've read more than I have," William said. "She says the ones with cracked spines facing inward is a clear tell." Jonathan looked at Amelia. She had the expression of someone who was not going to apologize for being accurate. "He asked," she said simply. Something tugged at the corner of his mouth. He let it. He sat down in the empty chair near the window, not his usual chair, which William had taken, and looked at the papers covering the desk. "What did you find?" he asked. She told him. All of it, systematically, without embellishment. The 17 problems in order of urgency. The reconstructed accounts, which showed the true extent of Pierce's activity. The staffing gaps and what it would cost to address them properly. The South grain bin situation and why it needed to be handled within the week. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "The total loss from Pierce," he said. "Your estimate. $270 over 14 months, she said. "I revised it upward from last night. I found 2 additional areas he'd been manipulating." Jonathan was quiet. "Mr. Caldwell," she said carefully, "this isn't a catastrophic loss for an estate this size. What Pierce did was dishonest, and it needs to be addressed. But Caldwell Ridge is not in real danger. The problems are correctable, most of them quickly." He looked at her. "You're reassuring me. I'm giving you accurate information," she said, "which in this case happens to be more reassuring than what you probably imagined." A pause. Then, "What do you need from me to begin?" "Authorization to hire 2 farmhands to replace the ones Pierce let go. Budget approval for the grain bin repair. I have a number in mind. I think we can do it for less than $30 if we use the timber from the East Field clearing. And your word that you'll speak directly to Samuel before the week is out. He's a good man. He needs to hear from you, not from me." Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. "You think I've been neglecting the people on this estate? I think you've been grieving for a long time," she said quietly. "And grief takes up the space that management requires. That's not a moral failing. It's what grief does." She paused. "But it's been 4 months since Pierce left. The neglect since then has been noticed by everyone who works here." The silence was heavier this time. "That's plain speech," he said. "You told me last night not to excuse things that shouldn't be excused," she said. "I'm applying the same standard." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled, slow and controlled. "All right," he said. "Hire the farmhands. Approve the grain bin repair. I'll speak to Samuel tomorrow morning." He stood. "Supper will be ready soon. I'd like you and William at the table." It was the first time he'd said "I'd like," rather than simply stating an expectation. She noticed. The days that followed moved at the pace of a household finding its feet again. Amelia worked from before dawn to after dark, and she did it without complaint and without drama, which turned out to be the most effective possible approach. The farmhands who'd been uncertain of their futures became certain. The kitchen staff, who'd been wary of her, began, cautiously, then more openly, to treat her as someone who was on their side. Samuel, after Jonathan spoke with him on Tuesday morning, came to find her in the study that afternoon. "He offered to adjust my compensation," Samuel said. He sounded like he wasn't entirely sure the conversation had happened. "Good," Amelia said. "He said it was overdue." "It was." Samuel looked at her. "Did you tell him what to say?" "I told him what the situation was," she said. "What he said was his own." Samuel nodded slowly. Then he said, "The South bin will be ready to start on Friday. I found us 2 men from the county who'll do it for $26 all in. Below my estimate," she said. "Well done." He didn't quite smile, but he stood slightly differently when he left. The first real crack in the surface of things appeared on a Thursday afternoon, 9 days after Amelia arrived. She was in the kitchen working through the supply accounts with Mrs. Holt when she heard a horse come fast up the drive, which was not in itself unusual. What was unusual was the sound of Jonathan's voice in the front hall shortly after. Tight, controlled, the particular cadence of a man keeping something contained. She heard one other voice, male, self-assured, too loud for an indoor space. She stayed where she was. Mrs. Holt's hands, which had been efficient and calm all morning, had gone very still. "Who is that?" Amelia said. A pause. "Richard Beaumont." The name was new to her, but the tone it was said in was not. "Tell me," Amelia said. Mrs. Holt set down the account book. "He owns land to the north. He and Mr. Caldwell have had disagreements over the boundary line between their properties for going on 6 years. Beaumonts argued twice in county court that the boundary was drawn wrong in the original deed. Lost both times. She paused. He's also... I shouldn't speak on it. Please, Amelia said. Another pause. Heavier. He came calling when Mrs. Eleanor was alive. More than once. Mr. Caldwell always met him himself and sent him off. But after she passed and Mr. Caldwell withdrew from things, Beaumont started coming by the estate with different questions. What kind of questions? About whether the estate might be available for purchase. Mrs. Holt said it flatly. He's tried twice to make an offer. Both times Mr. Caldwell sent him a letter saying the estate was not and would never be for sale. Amelia absorbed this. Is he the kind of man who accepts no for an answer? She asked. Mrs. Holt looked at her directly. No, she said. He is not. She encountered Beaumont on his way out. She was crossing the front hall with a stack of supply ledgers when he came through the parlor doorway. Jonathan 2 steps behind him, with the expression of a man who had just spent 20 minutes in a conversation that had not gone the direction the other person wanted. Beaumont was about 40, broad-shouldered, well-dressed in the way that men dressed who wanted you to notice how well-dressed they were. He had a wide, confident face and the eyes of someone accustomed to assessing value in things. Those eyes moved to Amelia. Then they moved over her, the plain dress, the stack of ledgers, the ink on the side of her hand, in a way that classified her into a category and moved on. Caldwell, he said, without looking away from Amelia. You didn't mention you'd gotten married. The ceremony is next week, Jonathan said. His voice was even. Beaumont smiled in the slow, comfortable way of a man who had just found something useful. Well then. He tipped his hat in Amelia's direction. Miss, welcome to the county. Thank you, she said. His eyes dropped to the ledgers in her arms. Household accounts? Estate accounts, she said. A small pause. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. I didn't realize you'd taken on a bookkeeper, he said to Jonathan. I haven't, Jonathan said. Beaumont looked between them. Then his smile returned, wider than before, but not warmer. Well, he said, I'm sure I'll see you both at the Harrington gathering next month. He left. Jonathan stood in the hallway after the door closed and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Then he looked at Amelia. How much did you hear? He asked. Nothing of your conversation. Mrs. Holt told me who he was. She kept her voice neutral. He's going to come back. He always comes back. What does he actually want? The land? Or is there something specific about the arrangement with the northern boundary? Jonathan moved into the study. She followed, setting the ledgers on the desk. The boundary dispute, he said, is a pretext. What Beaumont wants is the eastern acreage along the creek. That's the best water access in 3 counties. If he had it, he could expand his operation significantly, and my estate would be landlocked from the only reliable water source on the south side. Amelia was quiet, thinking. The original deed, she said. Is it in your possession? In the strongbox. I'd like to look at it. He looked at her. Why? Because men like Beaumont, who have lost a legal argument twice and keep returning anyway, are either stupid or they know something. She met his eyes. He doesn't seem stupid. A beat. No, Jonathan said. He's not. I went to the strongbox. The original deed for Caldwell Ridge was 41 years old and had been drawn up by a county surveyor whose handwriting was precise and whose notations were thorough. Amelia read it twice, slowly, while Jonathan stood at the window. On her second reading she found it. It was not in the main text. It was in a marginal notation, a small addendum written in different ink, which could mean it had been added later, or could simply mean the surveyor had used a second pen for annotations. The notation referenced a point of origin for the eastern boundary that was described by landmark rather than by fixed measurement. A landmark that might, depending on how you read the language, have moved. What was this tree? She said, pointing to the notation. The one referenced as the starting point for the eastern line. Jonathan came to look. His face tightened. It was a white oak, he said, on the ridge above the creek. It came down in the storm of 1809. And when it came down, the county resurveyed. The surveyor's office said the new measurement was consistent with the original deed. He paused. Beaumont argued it wasn't. He said the new measurement placed the line 6 feet further east than the original tree established. 6 feet, Amelia said. That doesn't seem like much. It's not 6 feet that matters, Jonathan said. It's where those 6 feet fall. If his reading of the original deed is correct, then the current boundary line cuts across the corner of the creek access in a way that technically— He stopped. Technically gives him a legal argument, she finished. He's never been able to make it stick. The county court ruled against him both times. But he has new information, Amelia said. Or he thinks he does. Otherwise, why come back now, when he knows you've just acquired a wife who's apparently managing your accounts? She looked up. He came today specifically because he'd heard about me. He wanted to assess whether my presence changes his calculation. Jonathan was very still. Does it? He asked, in a voice that was careful in a new way. If he's been assuming that a distracted, grieving widower would eventually be willing to sell or settle to make the problem go away, then yes, she said. My presence changes it, because I'm not going to let Caldwell Ridge be managed the way it has been, and a well-run estate is an estate that doesn't need to make desperate bargains. The stillness in the room shifted. You've been here 9 days, Jonathan said quietly. I know. You're speaking about this estate like it's yours. She met his gaze without flinching. Isn't it? Isn't that what you needed? Someone to treat it as their own? The silence stretched long enough that she started to wonder if she'd overstepped. Then Jonathan said very quietly, Yes, that's exactly what I needed. She looked back at the deed. I want to find the original surveyor's notes, not the county record, the surveyor's own working documents. If they still exist. Every surveyor keeps a field book. That was 41 years ago. Then it'll take some searching, she said. Do you know if the family who originally commissioned the deed kept any records? My father might have. There's a trunk in the attic. Tomorrow? She said. He almost smiled. Tomorrow, he said. The Harrington gathering was mentioned 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, by Mrs. Holt, by one of the farmhand's wives, by the dressmaker who came out from town to fit Amelia for 2 new dresses, because Jonathan had, without fuss or announcement, simply arranged for it. You'll need something appropriate for public occasions, he said when the dressmaker arrived. No further explanation. Amelia didn't argue. What she learned from the dressmaker was more useful, in its way, than anything she'd found in the account books. The woman talked the way women in small county circles always talked, with the specificity of people who had been observing the same families for decades and had strong opinions about everything they'd seen. Jonathan Caldwell, she said, had not attended a social gathering since Eleanor died. 8 years. The county had mostly stopped expecting him. Richard Beaumont, on the other hand, attended everything and had managed, over the same 8 years, to position himself as the most influential man in the northern half of the county. He had done this through a combination of money, strategic marriage alliances among his business partners, and the kind of slow, patient accumulation of social goodwill that looked like generosity and functioned like a long game. He's a schemer, the dressmaker said, without any particular malice. Just observation. But he's a polite one. People like him well enough. And Mr. Caldwell? People respect him. It's not the same thing. She pinned them with efficient movements. He was well liked before Eleanor died. After, she shook her head. He went quiet. Quiet men make people nervous. They start wondering what the quiet is hiding. Amelia thought about Jonathan in the study that first night, sitting across from her with the ledgers between them, listening to everything she said without interrupting. She thought about the way he'd said I should have looked more closely and simply sat with the weight of it. I don't think he's hiding anything, she said. The dressmaker looked at her over her spectacles. No, she said, with the considering air of someone revising an opinion in real time. I don't suppose he is. That thing. The trunk in the attic took 2 days to go through properly. Jonathan pulled it down himself and carried it to the study, and they worked through it together, which was not something she'd planned for, but which turned out to be the most useful arrangement possible. He knew the family history. She knew what she was looking for. Between the two of them, they went through 40 years of accumulated paper in a way that neither could have managed alone. They found the surveyor's field book on the afternoon of the second day. It was small, leather-bound, its pages brittle at the edges. Amelia handled it carefully. Jonathan stood behind her, close enough that she could hear him breathing when she turned the pages. "There," he said suddenly, his hand coming past her shoulder to indicate a page. She felt the warmth of his presence at her back before she registered the words on the page. "The original notations," she said. "In the field book. Look at the measurement," he said. "The field book gives an exact distance from the ridgeline to the marker tree." Beaumont's argument has always been based on the assumption that the marker tree was the starting point of the boundary line. But in the field book, she said, the tree is listed as a landmark beside the starting point, not the starting point itself. She looked up, turning slightly, and found his face very close to hers because he'd been leaning forward to look at the book. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he straightened. "The county court never had access to this," he said. "The county court was working from the deed and the resurvey," she said, turning back to the book. "This would change the argument entirely. We'd need a lawyer to formalize it." "Yes. I know a good one in Richmond." "Then you should write to him," she said, "before Beaumont makes his next move." She was very aware of him standing behind her, not quite touching, the warmth of someone who had been working in close proximity for 2 days. "Amelia," he said. "Yes, I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it as sincerely as it's meant." She turned to face him. He was looking at her with an expression that she did not yet have the vocabulary for, not because it was difficult to read, but because it was more straightforward than she was accustomed to receiving, unguarded in a way that seemed to cost him something. "I brought you here because I needed a practical arrangement," he said. "I was wrong about what I was actually getting." She waited. "This estate," he said, "has been steadily coming back to life for 9 days. Not because of anything I did, because of what you did. The staff is different. William is different." He paused. "I am different." He held her gaze. "I wanted to say that plainly, before it becomes something I assume you know without having said it." Amelia's throat did something inconvenient. She made herself answer steadily. "I appreciate that. That's all you're going to give me?" he asked, and there was the faintest trace of something almost gentle in his voice. "I'm still working out what to do with it," she said honestly. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the respect of a man who understood that honesty was worth more than a polished answer. "Fair enough," he said. He looked back at the field book. "I'll write to the lawyer tonight." "Good," she said. "And tomorrow I want to start on the north pasture fencing." He looked at her sideways. "Of course you do," he said. And this time, what moved across his face was unmistakably a smile. What she did not know, what she could not yet know, because it had not yet reached Caldwell Ridge, was that Richard Beaumont had, that same afternoon, paid a visit to the county register's office in town. He had asked to review a particular set of old documents, and the clerk who assisted him had, when asked later, remembered only that the gentleman had spent a long time with a specific file, and that when he left, he'd been smiling. The letter from Richmond arrived on a Tuesday, 12 days after Jonathan had written to his lawyer. Amelia was in the study when he read it. She'd learned by now that Jonathan Caldwell read correspondence the way he did everything else, completely, without reaction, until he'd processed the full content and decided what he thought about it. She'd stopped trying to read his expression midway through a letter. "It told you nothing until he was done." He set it down. "Daniel Marsh," he said, "my lawyer. He says the field book changes the argument substantially. He wants to come out from Richmond next week to review it in person before we make any formal move." "That's good news," Amelia said. "He also says Beaumont's attorney filed a new petition with the county court 3 days ago." He paused. "Beaumont isn't waiting for us to make the first move." She'd expected this. The clerk's memory of Beaumont's visit to the register's office had reached her through Mrs. Holt, who had it from the dressmaker, who had it from her cousin, who worked in town. Small counties had long memories and short distances between people. "What's the basis of the new petition?" she asked. Jonathan looked at the letter again. "He's claiming that the resurvey of 1809 was conducted improperly, that the surveyor who did it had a conflict of interest." A pause. "The surveyor in 1809 was my father's cousin." The room went very quiet. "That's a different argument than the tree," Amelia said. "Yes, he's abandoned the tree entirely. This is a procedural attack on the resurvey itself." Jonathan set the letter flat on the desk. "If he can get the 1809 resurvey thrown out, we're back to the original deed. And the original deed, without the field book to clarify the language, could be read either way. But we have the field book, which has never been formally entered into any legal record, which Beaumont may not know exists." He looked at her. "Or he may know, and is moving now to establish his ground before we can use it." Amelia thought about Beaumont standing in the front hallway 2 weeks ago, those assessing eyes moving over her ledgers, the smile that wasn't warm. "He came here to find out what we knew," she said, "and he decided we didn't know enough to stop him." "Apparently. Then we need to give Daniel Marsh the field book before Beaumont's petition is heard." She stood. "How quickly can Marsh get here?" "I'll write today and ask him to come as soon as possible." "Do that." She was already moving toward the study door, thinking through the sequence. "I also want to look at the 1809 resurvey records again, the ones in the county register's office. If Beaumont is claiming procedural impropriety, there has to be something in those records he thinks supports his argument. I want to know what it is before Marsh gets here." Jonathan looked at her. "The county office is in town." "I know where it is." "I'll take you tomorrow." She stopped and turned. He was watching her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of something that would have been open admiration in a less restrained man. "You don't have to accompany me," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." The ride into town. The next morning was the first time they'd been in close quarters outside of Caldwell Ridge, and it was the first time Amelia had a sustained opportunity to observe Jonathan Caldwell in relation to the world beyond his estate. He was different in public than she expected, not warmer exactly, but more present, more engaged with the landscape of other people. He tipped his hat to 3 men they passed on the road, and each of them responded with the particular respect that people showed not to wealth, but to a man they'd decided was worth respecting. It was a distinction she'd learned to notice. Money got deference. Character got something else. "People here think well of you," she said, when they'd passed the 3rd man. "They thought well of my father," Jonathan said. "Some of it carries." "That's not what I'm seeing." He glanced at her sideways. "What are you seeing?" "A man who knows their names," she said. "You called that last man by name. He called you by yours without the mister. That's not inherited respect. That's earned." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "You observe everything, don't you?" "It's a habit," she said. "Useful or inconvenient depending on the situation." "Not inconvenient so far," he said. She looked out at the road ahead. The morning was warm, the sky the pale blue of a Virginia summer before the heat took hold. "How long has it been since you came to town?" A pause. 8 months. She didn't comment on that. She didn't need to. The county register's office was managed by a man named Elias Thorne, who was approximately 60, meticulous in the way that men who had managed paper records for 30 years became meticulous, and visibly surprised to see Jonathan Caldwell walk through his door. "Mr. Caldwell." He stood. "This is unexpected." "Mr. Thorne." Jonathan shook his hand. "This is Miss Whitaker. She'll be reviewing the resurvey records from 1809. Whatever she asks for, please provide it." Thorne looked at Amelia with the slightly uncertain expression of a man who wasn't sure what category she fell into. "The resurvey records." "The full file," Amelia said, "including any correspondence attached to it, and any notations made after the original filing." Thorne retrieved the file. Amelia worked through it at the clerk's table, while Jonathan stood near the door, patient and watchful. She read slowly, because the value of old documents was in the details that weren't meant to be noticed. She found it 40 minutes in. It was a notation added to the file in 1811, 2 years after the resurvey. A small handwritten addendum at the bottom of the second surveyor's certification page, initialed by a county official. The notation referenced a discrepancy in the chain measurements that had been resolved by the surveyor's verbal confirmation. No written documentation of that confirmation. No independent verification. "Mr. Thorne?" she said without looking up. "Who added this notation?" Thorne came over, looked. His face did something complicated. "That would be the county recorder at the time, Marcus Webb." "And Marcus Webb is—" "He died in 1814. A pause. "His estate was settled by his nephew." Amelia looked up from the file. "What was his nephew's name?" A longer pause. "Carter Beaumont," Thorne said. "Richard Beaumont's brother." The silence in the office had the density of something that had just clicked into place. Jonathan had moved away from the door. "The notation was added to the file," Amelia said carefully, "by a county official whose estate was later managed by Richard Beaumont's brother. And the notation itself introduces the only substantive ambiguity in an otherwise clean resurvey record." "I can't speak to anyone's intentions," Thorne said. He looked uncomfortable. "No," she agreed. "But you can confirm that the notation exists, when it was added, and who added it." "I can confirm those things. I'd like a certified copy of the full file," she said, "including that page." Jonathan didn't speak until they were back in the carriage and moving out of town. Then he said, he had someone plant that notation. Or the notation was genuinely innocent, and Beaumont simply found it and recognized it could be made useful, Amelia said. "We can't prove intent. We can prove the notation exists and establish that it has no supporting documentation." "Which is enough to discredit it?" "It's enough to make Marcia's job considerably easier." She held the certified copy in her lap. "The field book, combined with this, gives you a very strong position. Beaumont's new petition is built on a procedural argument that depends on that notation having weight. Without it, he's back to the tree argument, which he already lost twice." Jonathan exhaled through his nose. "He's been working on this for years." "Yes." "Why now? Why file now, after 8 years of waiting?" She looked at him. "Because something changed. Because he assessed Caldwell Ridge as a household in disorder, with an owner who wasn't engaged, and decided the moment was right." She paused. "And then something else changed." "You arrived," he said flatly. "I arrived," she said. "He came to look at us and decided we didn't know enough to be a real obstacle. He was wrong about that." Jonathan looked out at the road. His jaw was set in a way she'd learned to read as something between anger and resolve. "He was wrong about a great many things," he said quietly. The Harrington gathering arrived on a Saturday in late August, with the particular energy of a county social event that everyone had been anticipating for weeks. The kind of evening where information moved faster than conversation and impressions lasted longer than facts. The Harrington House was the largest private residence in the county after Caldwell Ridge, and its gatherings drew the full breadth of local society. Landowners, their wives, their eligible children, the lawyers and physicians and clergy who formed the connective tissue of county life. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone watched everyone. Jonathan had told her, on the drive over, that this would be the first time he'd attended anything like this in 8 years. She had said, "Then we'll make it count." He'd looked at her. "You sound like a general." "I spent years managing a household that couldn't afford to make social missteps," she said. "I learned to treat every public occasion as a situation that required strategy." "And what's the strategy tonight?" "We arrive together. We speak to people together, at least initially. We don't separate until we've established, clearly, that we're a unit that's operating from the same position." She paused. "And when Beaumont says something, and he will say something, we answer it calmly and without defensiveness." Jonathan had been quiet for a moment. Then, "You've already mapped all of this out." "I've been mapping it since Tuesday," she said. She heard something in his exhale that was very close to a laugh. Margaret Harrington was a woman who had been managing the social architecture of the county for 30 years, and she received Jonathan's arrival with the barely contained delight of someone who had been hoping for exactly this and hadn't dared to say so. "Jonathan." She took both his hands. "It has been far too long." "It has," he said. "Mrs. Harrington, this is Amelia Whitaker." Margaret Harrington turned to Amelia with the swift, comprehensive assessment of a woman who could take in an entire person in 4 seconds, and had been doing it so long she wasn't even conscious of it. Then she smiled. Not the social smile she'd had ready. Something warmer and more genuine. "My dear," she said, "I've heard a great deal about you already. Come in. There are people who want to meet you." What Amelia had not fully anticipated was the weight of the room's attention. She'd been in social situations before, but always as the least significant person present, the one people looked past on their way to someone more interesting. Tonight was different. Tonight she was on Jonathan Caldwell's arm, which meant she was the unknown quantity in a room full of people who had known each other for decades and were very curious about what had changed. She met the looks directly, answered questions without deflecting, listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, she was specific rather than general, which people always responded to better than they realized they were responding to. Jonathan stayed close, not clinging, not hovering, but present. She felt it as a kind of steadiness at her side, the awareness of him moving when she moved, stepping slightly forward when someone spoke to her in a way that felt testing rather than genuinely curious. They had been there perhaps 40 minutes when Richard Beaumont found them. He came across the room with the ease of a man who owned every room he entered, his smile wide and apparently warm, his eyes doing what they always did, moving, assessing, deciding. "Caldwell." He extended his hand. Jonathan shook it. "And Miss Whitaker, or should I say, soon-to-be Mrs. Caldwell." "Either is fine," Amelia said pleasantly. "I hear you've been making quite an impression at the Ridge," Beaumont said. "People talk. Small county." "That's kind of them," she said. "Running the accounts, I heard." His smile broadened. "Caldwell, you've found yourself a capable woman." "I have," Jonathan said. His voice was even, not warm. "Funny thing," Beaumont said, in the tone of a man who was about to say something he'd been waiting to say. "My attorney received a communication this week suggesting you might be contesting our pending petition." "Your attorney received a communication from mine," Jonathan said, "which is how legal correspondence works." Beaumont's smile didn't waver. "Of course. I only mention it because I'd hate for there to be any pleasantness between neighbors. We've always managed things amicably." "Have we?" Jonathan said. Not a question. Something flickered in Beaumont's expression. Just for a moment. "I'm sure we can work this out between us," Beaumont said. "Without the courts needing to be involved. I'd be willing to discuss a settlement that works for both parties." "That's generous," Amelia said, before Jonathan could answer. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. "When your attorney receives our formal response next week, it will include documentation that we believe makes the position quite clear. But if there's room for a conversation after that, I'm sure Mr. Caldwell would be open to one." Beaumont looked at her. It was the first time he'd looked at her directly, really looked, and she saw in it the moment he revised his assessment. The moment he understood she was not a bookkeeper. She was not an arrangement. She was the person who had found whatever he hadn't wanted them to find. "Looking forward to it," he said. He moved away. Jonathan waited until Beaumont was fully across the room before he leaned slightly toward her and said, in a voice low enough for only her to hear, "You just told him we have something." "We had something," she said, equally quiet. "I told him we know we have something. That's different." A pause. "How is it different?" "One is a fact. The other is a warning." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think I should have brought you into this fight 6 years ago." She looked up at him. He was watching Beaumont across the room, his expression composed, but his eyes carrying something that had more heat in it than his usual watchfulness. "You didn't know I existed 6 years ago," she said. "My loss," he said quietly. She had no response for that. So she looked out at the room and let it settle between them, warm and unresolved. It was later in the evening, when the gathering had reached the comfortable middle hours where wine had been consumed and positions had relaxed, that everything changed. Amelia had been speaking with Margaret Harrington and two other women. A pleasant conversation about kitchen gardens, of all things, in which she'd apparently said something about soil acidity that Margaret found fascinating, and that led naturally to a 20-minute exchange about the practical mechanics of maintaining a large estate household. She was relaxed, more relaxed than she'd been all evening. She didn't notice Millicent Voss positioning herself until the woman spoke. Millicent Voss was 50, thin, and had the particular quality of a woman who had built her social currency entirely on being the first to say what others were thinking. "It's remarkable, really," Millicent said, addressing the small circle, but pitching her voice for Amelia specifically. "The Whitaker girl managing Caldwell accounts." She smiled in the way that women like her smiled, with all the warmth of the surface and none below it. "I suppose someone had to do it. Jonathan's been so absent from things, and she does seem quite practical." The word practical landed the way Millicent intended it to land, a substitute for the words she wasn't quite saying. Plain. Convenient. Not really one of us. Margaret Harrington's eyes sharpened. But before she could speak, Millicent continued, with the momentum of a woman who had been waiting for a room and had found one. "Of course, we all understand the arrangement. Thomas Whitaker needed his debt settled. She was available. It's very sensible." Another smile at Amelia. "Nothing wrong with sensible." Amelia looked at her steadily. She was aware of the room's attention. She was aware of Margaret Harrington beside her, drawing breath to intervene. She was aware, from across the room, that something in Jonathan's posture had changed, the way it did when his attention locked onto something. She smiled at Millicent Voss. "You're right that it's sensible," she said, in the same pleasant tone she'd used with Beaumont. "I've found that most things that look like mere practicality, looked at closely, are actually something more purposeful." She tilted her head slightly. "Mr. Caldwell needed someone who could run an estate. I needed somewhere that valued competence. Most people would call that mutual benefit. I call it a good match." She paused. "But I appreciate your interest in our household." Millicent blinked. She'd expected flinching. What she got was steady and smiling and completely unmoved, and she didn't quite know what to do with it. "Well," she said, "of course." Then Jonathan was there. She hadn't seen him cross the room. One moment he was on the far side of the gathering, and the next he was at Amelia's shoulder, close enough that it was unmistakable. A deliberate, physical statement of position. "Mrs. Voss," he said. His voice was even and very quiet. "I believe you were speaking about my household." The small circle went very still. Millicent's smile became uncertain. "Only saying what a fine—" "I'll save you the effort," Jonathan said. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quality of it, absolute and unhurried, was enough to make everyone present attend to it fully. Amelia Whitaker came to Caldwell Ridge 3 weeks ago. In 3 weeks she found and documented financial fraud that had been running for over a year. She rebuilt the confidence of a staff that had been left without direction. She identified a legal threat to my estate that I had not seen and found the evidence to counter it. She made my son laugh. He looked at Millicent directly. "You may call any of that what you wish. I call it indispensable." The word fell into the room and stayed there. Millicent opened her mouth, closed it. "I didn't choose Amelia Whitaker because her father owed me money," Jonathan continued. "I chose her because she was the only person in that room who answered my questions honestly. Everything I've learned since confirms that judgment." He looked at Amelia then, and his voice, still quiet, shifted into something that was not for the room at all. "I chose right." Amelia's chest did something that had nothing to do with practicality. She met his eyes and held them. "Thank you," she said. Quiet. Just for him. Margaret Harrington, who had been listening with the expression of a woman watching something she would discuss for the next 6 months, cleared her throat gently. "Well," she said warmly, "shall we go in for supper?" The drive home from the Harrington gathering moved in silence for the first several minutes. Not uncomfortable silence, but the full kind. The kind that follows something that doesn't need to be talked over immediately. It was Amelia who spoke first. "You didn't have to say all of that." "I know I didn't have to," Jonathan said. He was looking at the road ahead. "I wanted to." "Millicent Voss is going to talk about tonight for months." "Good," he said. "Let her say what she wants. What she'll say is that I chose you publicly. She can editorialize however she likes." Amelia looked at her hands in her lap. Something was happening in her chest that she'd been managing all evening. Managing because she'd needed to be present and strategic and clear-headed. And the thing happening in her chest was none of those things. It was warm and inconvenient, and it had been growing since the moment he'd appeared at her shoulder in that room, and made himself a wall between her and the condescension that had followed her whole life. "You said I was indispensable," she said. "Yes." "You said you chose right." "Also yes, Jonathan." She said his name, his given name, which she'd started using at some point over the past 2 weeks without marking the moment, and he turned to look at her. "What are you saying?" He held her gaze for a moment. The carriage moved through the dark Virginia road, the night thick with summer and cricket sound. "I think you know what I'm saying," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I want to hear you say it clearly." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man withholding. The quiet of a man who had spent 8 years not saying things clearly and was working out how to change that. "I'm saying that I came to your father's house looking for an arrangement," he said. "And I found something I didn't know I was looking for." His voice was careful, measured, but underneath the measurement there was something that wasn't measured at all. "I'm saying that this estate is alive again in a way it hasn't been since Eleanor died. I'm saying that William asked me last week if you were going to stay, and I'm saying that I have no interest in you staying out of obligation." He paused. "I want you to stay because you want to be here." Amelia's throat was doing that inconvenient thing again. "I do want to be here," she said quietly. "Then that's what matters," he said. He looked back at the road. She looked at the road too, beside each other in the dark, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "For the record," she said, after a moment, "I chose right too." He didn't respond immediately. Then quietly, "I'm glad." What neither of them knew, riding home through the August dark, was that Millicent Voss was not the only person at the Harrington gathering who had been watching and calculating. Beaumont had left the gathering early, unusually early, within an hour of Jonathan's public statement about Amelia, which several people would later recall was also, almost to the minute, the same time a rider left the Harrington property in the direction of town. Richard Beaumont was a patient man who had been playing a long game. Jonathan Caldwell's declaration at the Harrington gathering had not frightened him. It had shown him something more useful than fear could have. It had shown him the exact thing that could be used, because Jonathan Caldwell had just told a room full of people, told everyone in the county who mattered, that Amelia Whittaker was the reason Caldwell Ridge had come back to life, that she had found the evidence, that she had managed the accounts, that she was indispensable, which meant that if you wanted to break Jonathan Caldwell's position, you didn't need to go after Jonathan Caldwell. You went after Amelia and Richard Beaumont, who had spent 2 days in the county register's office and had found something far more useful than a surveyor's notation, already knew exactly how. The rider reached town by midnight. The message he carried was addressed to a man in Philadelphia, a man who knew the Whittaker family well, a man who had, for the past 3 years, held a particular piece of information that Thomas Whittaker had paid a great deal of money to keep buried. The message from Beaumont was short. It said, "It's time." Amelia didn't sleep well that night, not because of anything she knew, but because of the particular quality of the night, the way the air sat wrong, the way she woke twice from dreams she couldn't hold on to, the way her mind kept circling back to Beaumont's face in the moment she'd told him they had documentation. He hadn't been afraid. He'd been calculating. She sat up in her room in the dark, thinking about what a man like Richard Beaumont would do when his legal strategy was countered. Men like Beaumont, patient, Long-game men. Men who'd been working toward something for years. They didn't simply accept defeat and go home. They pivoted. She thought about what she knew. The field book. The certified copy from the register's office. Marsh coming next week. Their position on the land dispute was strong. So if she were Beaumont, and the land argument was weakening, what would she do? She'd attack something else. She'd attack the ground the opposition was standing on, not the legal argument. She'd attack Amelia. She sat with that thought in the dark, turning it over. She was not afraid. Exactly. But there was something underneath the not fear. A cold, clear awareness that she was more exposed than she'd been before the Harrington gathering. That Jonathan's words tonight, as much as they had warmed something in her that had been cold for a long time, had also made her visible in a new way. Before tonight, she was Jonathan Caldwell's practical arrangement. After tonight, she was the reason he was fighting. She pulled her knees to her chest and looked at the dark ceiling. Whatever Beaumont was planning, she needed to be ready for it. She just had to figure out, before he moved, what it was. She found out on a Wednesday. Not from Jonathan. Not from Mrs. Holt. Not from any of the people at Caldwell Ridge who had, over the past weeks, become something close to allies. She found out from a letter that arrived addressed to her in handwriting she recognized immediately, her father's. Careful, upright, the handwriting of a man who had always been more comfortable with written words than spoken ones, because written words could be revised before anyone saw them. She opened it at the breakfast table before Jonathan came down, which was unusual because Jonathan was always down before her. She registered the absence of him distantly, the way you registered familiar things when your mind was already somewhere else. The letter was short. Amelia. I have been informed that a man named Richard Beaumont has made contact with persons in Philadelphia who have knowledge of an old matter concerning your arrangement with Mr. Caldwell. I believe he intends to use this information to challenge the legitimacy of your union. You should know that I was not the one who gave him this information. I am writing to warn you because whatever mistakes I have made, I would not see you destroyed by them. Come home if you need to. Your father. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the table beside her cup and looked at the wall and thought about what an old matter concerning your arrangement could possibly mean. She thought for a long time. When Jonathan came downstairs, she was still sitting there. He looked at her face and stopped. What happened? He said. Not a question. She handed him the letter. He read it standing up, which was how she knew it had hit him harder than his face was showing. Jonathan Caldwell sat to read things. He stood when he needed the physical position of standing, when something had shifted under him and he needed to feel his own footing. He set the letter down. An old matter, he said. I don't know what it refers to, she said. I want to be clear about that. I don't know what my father is referring to. But you have a guess. She looked at him steadily. My father was desperate when he arranged our marriage. Desperate men sometimes make more than one arrangement, in different directions, as a way of covering their options. She paused. I knew about the debt to you. I didn't know about everything else. Jonathan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at her with the focused, unhurried attention he brought to things that required real thought. Tell me what you know, he said. All of it. Even what you're not sure of. She told him. She told him about the ledger entries she'd noticed at Whitaker, years ago, that hadn't added up. Small withdrawals that had no corresponding household expenditure. She told him about the letter her mother had burned. She told him about a conversation she'd half heard through the study door when she was 20. Her father's voice tight with something that sounded like negotiation, speaking to someone who wasn't family. She told him about the name she'd caught in that conversation, a name she hadn't thought about in 5 years because she'd had no reason to. Jonathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Beaumont found someone in Philadelphia, he said. Yes? And whatever that person knows, your father thinks it's enough to challenge our marriage. That's what the letter implies. Another silence. His jaw was set in the way she knew now as the exterior of something working hard underneath. I need to go home, she said. He looked at her. To my father's house, she clarified. I need to talk to him directly. The letter is too vague. I need to know exactly what Beaumont has before he uses it. I'll come with you, Jonathan said immediately. No. She said it gently, but without hesitation. If you come, my father will manage what he tells me. He'll say what he thinks sounds acceptable in front of you. If I go alone, he'll tell me the truth, because there's no one to perform for. She held Jonathan's gaze. I know how to talk to him. I've been doing it my whole life. Jonathan didn't look pleased about this. When? He said. Today. He exhaled through his nose. Marsh arrives Friday. I'll be back by Thursday night. She stood. I need you to stay here and prepare everything for Marsh. The field book, the certified copy, the account reconstruction. Lay it all out so that when I return, we can present him with a complete picture. She paused. Can you do that? He looked at her for a long moment. You're giving me a task so I don't spend the next 2 days worrying, he said. I'm giving you a task because it genuinely needs doing, she said. The worrying is incidental. Something moved through his expression that was complicated and warm and frustrated all at once. Amelia, he said. Yes. Be careful. It was not a command. It was the way a man said something when he had more to say and wasn't ready to say all of it yet. I will, she said. The road back to Whittaker felt shorter than the road away from it had, which she supposed was how it always worked. Distance was measured in what you were moving toward, not in miles. She thought about her father's letter the whole way. I was not the one who gave him this information, which meant someone else had, which meant Beaumont had been looking, actively looking, for something to use, and had found a source willing to provide it. The question was what? She arrived at her family home in the early afternoon. The house looked smaller than she remembered. She wasn't sure if that was because she'd changed or because distance did that to the places you'd been relieved to leave. Her mother was in the front room and came to the hallway when she heard the door. Amelia. Genuine surprise, and beneath it something else, something careful. We weren't expecting. I need to speak to Father, Amelia said. Today, now. Her mother's expression confirmed what she'd suspected. Her mother knew. He's in the study, she said quietly. Thomas Whittaker looked older than he had 2 months ago. He stood when she came in, which he'd never done when she was a child. The standing was new, and she understood it as the physical expression of something that had shifted between them since the morning she'd left. She was no longer simply his youngest daughter. She was something else now, something that required a different posture. Amelia. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit down. I'd rather stand, she said. Tell me about the arrangement with Beaumont. He flinched. It was small, the tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible pull of his shoulders inward. But she knew her father's face, and she caught it. There's no arrangement with Beaumont, he said. Then tell me what he has, she said. Tell me what you were afraid to put in the letter. Her father looked at his desk, at his hands, at the window, at everywhere except her face. Father. Her voice was steady. I need the truth. All of it. Right now. A long silence. Then Thomas Whittaker sat back down, heavily, and looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally run out of road. 3 years ago, he said, when the estate was failing and I had exhausted every legitimate option, I made an agreement with a man named Gerald Forsyth in Philadelphia. Amelia was very still. What kind of agreement? A loan, her father said. Substantial. Enough to cover the most pressing debts and buy time for the harvest to recover. He paused. The terms were not standard. Forsyth required collateral beyond the land. What collateral? Her father looked at her directly for the first time since she'd walked in. He required a guarantee, he said slowly, that in the event the loan could not be repaid within 2 years, the settlement would include a marital arrangement, his nephew, a young man named Forsyth Jr., based in Philadelphia. He exhaled. I agreed to it in writing. The room felt very quiet. You promised me, Amelia said. Her voice was perfectly level. She was holding it level through sheer practice. In writing, to another man, before Jonathan Caldwell came to this house. It was contingent, her father said quickly. Only if the loan wasn't repaid. And I intended to repay. Was it repaid? A pause. No, he said. She stood there and let that settle through her. Not anger exactly. Something colder than anger. The particular feeling of having a thing you'd suspected confirmed. The sensation of the floor being exactly where you expected it to be, but still feeling it under your feet differently now that you knew for certain it was there. Does Forsyth still hold the document? She asked. I believe so. And Beaumont found him. I don't know how, but yes. Beaumont's attorney sent me a letter 2 weeks ago. That's when I wrote to you. They claim the written agreement constitutes a prior contractual obligation that invalidates your marriage to Caldwell. Her father's voice had gone thin. Amelia, I never thought. When Caldwell came, I didn't think about the Forsyth document. I thought it was dormant. You thought a great many things that weren't true, she said quietly. He looked at his hand. Father. She moved to the chair after all and sat down, because this was going to take longer than she'd planned, and she needed to think. I need to see the original loan document, whatever copy you have. It's in the strong box. Get it. He got it. The document was 4 pages, written in the careful formal language of a man who had spent his professional life making certain that agreements meant exactly what he needed them to mean when he needed them to mean it. Amelia read it 3 times. On her 3rd reading, she found what she was looking for. The conditional clause, the one that triggered the marital arrangement, was structured in a way that was specific to the loan's repayment status as of a particular date. That date had passed 18 months ago. The clause stated that if the loan remained outstanding as of that date, the marital arrangement obligation came into effect. But there was a secondary clause that her father had apparently not focused on, or had perhaps not understood. The secondary clause required that the marital arrangement, if triggered, be formalized within 6 months of the trigger date. 6 months from the trigger date had passed 14 months ago. Father, she said carefully, did Forsyth ever contact you after the trigger date to formalize the arrangement? Her father frowned. He wrote once. I didn't. I was hoping to find another way to. Did you respond? No. Did he write again? No. She looked at the document. Then the arrangement was never formally invoked within the required window. The clause expired. Her father stared at her. What? The marital arrangement clause required formal invocation within 6 months of the trigger. Forsyth wrote once and you didn't respond. He never followed up within the time window. She set the document down. The clause is void, not because it wasn't triggered, it was, but because the invocation procedure wasn't followed by either party within the specified term. Her father looked at the document, then at her, then at the document again. Can that be argued legally? It can absolutely be argued legally, she said. The question is whether Beaumont knows about the time window failure. She thought about this. He may not. He found the document and saw the trigger clause and assumed it was active. He may not have read the invocation procedure carefully enough to notice the problem with his own argument. Or he did notice, her father said slowly, and he's counting on us not noticing. She looked at him. Yes, she said. That's also possible. Meg. She stayed at Whitaker that night. Her father, shaken and subdued in a way she hadn't seen before, gave her the full copy of the loan documents and everything he had from Forsyth. Her mother fed her supper and didn't ask questions, which was its own form of kindness. Her sisters were not at home. She was grateful for that. She didn't have the energy for Charlotte's managing or Harriet's wounded silences. Late that night, sitting at her old desk in her old room with the documents spread around her, she wrote out everything she'd found. Clear, sequential, the way she always organized information that needed to be communicated accurately to someone who would need to act on it. She also wrote a separate letter. To Daniel Marsh in Richmond, care of Jonathan's address, because Marsh was already traveling and would arrive at Caldwell Ridge within 2 days. She wrote, Mr. Marsh, There is an additional matter requiring your attention when you arrive. It involves a prior contractual document that a third party is intending to use against my marriage to Mr. Caldwell. I believe the document is legally void for reasons I will explain in person. Please bring any knowledge you have of Virginia contract law regarding conditional clauses and invocation procedures. This is urgent." She folded it, sealed it, and addressed it. Then she looked at what remained, the loan itself. $240 still outstanding. Her father had confirmed the amount with the same expression of a man confirming a wound. The loan was real, even if the marital clause had expired. Forsyth could still pursue her father for the debt. She thought about that for a long time. Then she thought about the account reconstruction she'd done at Caldwell Ridge. The money Pierce had taken. $270, recovered not as cash, but as documentation of fraud that Caldwell could potentially use in a legal claim against Pierce. She didn't have a complete answer, not yet. But the shape of one was beginning to form. She left Whitaker early the next morning, before her mother was fully up, because she needed to be back at Caldwell Ridge before dark, and because the longer she stayed in her father's house, the more she felt the weight of every year she'd spent invisible in it pressing down on her. Her father walked her out. At the gate he stopped. She stopped. "Amelia," he said. He was working up to something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. "I owe you more than an apology, I know that." She looked at him. Her father's face, worn with the specific exhaustion of a man who had been managing a sinking situation for too long, and was finally acknowledging the water. "You do," she said. "Not cruelly, just accurately. I treated you as a—" He stopped. "I never saw what you were capable of. I used you to solve a problem I'd created, and I told myself it was the best I could do for you." He met her eyes. "I don't believe that anymore. I'm not sure I believed it then." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said finally. "I know you weren't malicious. I know you were frightened, and you made the decisions that frightened men make." She paused. "But knowing that doesn't mean it didn't cost me something." "No," he said. "It doesn't." They stood at the gate in the morning quiet. "The loan documents," she said. "I'm taking them. I'll work on this from Caldwell Ridge with our lawyer. I'll do everything I can to resolve this in a way that doesn't leave you exposed." Her father blinked. "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because you're my father. And because the best way to deal with a man like Beaumont is to take away every piece of leverage he thinks he has." She picked up the travel bag. "Take care of yourself." She walked out through the gate without looking back. It was the second time she'd done that. This time, it felt entirely different. Jonathan was waiting on the steps of Caldwell Ridge when the carriage came through the gate. Not pacing, standing, the way he stood when he was holding something still by effort rather than ease. He came down the steps the moment he saw her. She got out of the carriage, and he was there, and the first thing he did was look at her face with the focused intensity of a man reading a situation he'd been worried about for 2 days. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right. What did you find?" "Inside," she said. "I'll tell you everything. Is Marsh here?" "Arrived this afternoon. He's in the study." He paused, still looking at her. Something in him hadn't quite released yet. "Amelia." "I'm all right," she said again, more gently. "Truly." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded and moved aside to let her in, and she felt his hand, brief, light, at her back as she passed him. Just a moment. Just the lightest touch of steadiness. She didn't say anything about it, but she felt it all the way through. Daniel Marsh was a compact, sharp-eyed man of about 50 who had the particular quality of a good lawyer, the ability to listen without interrupting and without letting his expression tell you what he thought before he was ready to tell you. He rose when Amelia came in. "Miss Whitaker." He shook her hand. "Your letter was intriguing." "I hope the reality lives up to it," she said, and sat down and spread the documents on the desk. She talked for an hour. Marsh listened. Jonathan sat beside her, and she noticed that he tracked everything she said with absolute attention, not checking her, not waiting to correct her, simply following the argument because he trusted her to make it correctly. That trust, quiet and unremarked, steadied her. When she finished, Marsh looked at the documents for a long moment. "The invocation window failure," he said. "You found this yourself?" "In the text of the clause, yes. It's not the most prominent feature of the document." "No," she agreed. "It's in the subordinate procedure section. Most people reading for the trigger clause wouldn't drill down to the invocation mechanism." Marsh looked at Jonathan. "Your wife found the hole in Beaumont's entire strategy." "She's not my wife yet," Jonathan said. "Friday." "Right." Marsh looked back at Amelia. "You said Forsyth never formally invoked within the window, and you have the original document, plus your father's confirmation that no response was sent." "Correct." "Then the marital clause is void. Beaumont's challenge to your marriage has no legal foundation." He paused. "He may not know that." "That was my suspicion," Amelia said. "He may have found the document and evaluated it quickly, looking for the existence of the prior obligation rather than its procedural validity." "Or," Marsh said, and his voice sharpened, "he knows it's void, and he intends to file anyway, banking on the fact that even a failed legal challenge causes enough reputational damage to accomplish what he actually wants." The room went quiet. Jonathan leaned forward. "Which is?" "To destabilize you," Marsh said simply. "A legal filing is public record. A man contesting the legitimacy of your marriage, even if he loses, plants a question in the county's mind. It puts you on the defensive. It divides your attention between the land dispute and the personal challenge at the exact moment you should be focused on the boundary petition." He looked between them. "Beaumont is a strategist. He's not expecting to win this particular move. He's expecting it to cost you." Amelia had thought of this. She'd been thinking of it since the drive home from the Harrington gathering, when she'd watched Beaumont's face and understood that he wasn't reacting to being outmaneuvered. He was recalculating. "Then we don't wait for him to file," she said. Both men looked at her. "If we know the marital clause is void, and we know the land petition is built on a compromised county notation, and we have the field book." She looked at Marsh. "Can we file first? Can we take our case to the county court before he moves on either front, and establish the legal record before he has a chance to plant his questions?" Marsh was very quiet for a moment. "It's aggressive," he said. "Yes. Most defendants wait to respond." "Most defendants haven't done the work we've done," she said. "We have 3 independently sourced pieces of evidence: the field book, the certified copy showing the notation's provenance. The loan document demonstrating the marital clause is void." She looked at him directly. "Beaumont is counting on us being reactive. He's set up this entire strategy on the assumption that we're behind him. We're not." Marsh looked at Jonathan. Jonathan looked at Amelia. "She's right," he said. Marsh picked up his pen. "Then let's talk about timing," he said. They worked until well past midnight. The 3 of them at the study table, documents spread, positions outlined, Marsh making notes in his precise lawyer's hand, while Amelia and Jonathan moved between explaining and deciding and arguing, not against each other but together, with the particular energy of 2 people who had arrived at the same conclusions from different angles, and found the overlap surprisingly complete. At some point, Mrs. Holt appeared with food that no one had asked for, but everyone ate without acknowledging, which was the highest form of Mrs. Holt's care, the kind that didn't make you stop what you were doing to address it. William appeared in the doorway at 10, already in his nightclothes, and assessed the room with those watchful eyes. "Is it bad?" he said. Jonathan looked at his son. "It was. We're fixing it." "Did Amelia figure out how?" "Largely, yes." William looked at Amelia. She looked back at him. "Good," he said, and went to bed. Marsh watched this exchange with the expression of a man updating his understanding of a household. "He's a good boy," Amelia said. "Hi is," Jonathan agreed. And the way he said it, simple, certain, with the weight of a man who had not always been sure of enough things, but was sure of this one, told her something about the version of Jonathan Caldwell that existed before the grief had taken up so much space. She filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. The break came at midnight, when Marsh sat back and looked at his notes with the satisfied expression of a man who had enough to work with. "I'll draft the filings tomorrow," he said. "We can be in front of the county court by end of next week if everything proceeds cleanly." He looked at Amelia. "You'll need to provide a sworn statement about the loan document and your conversations with your father." "Willingly," she said. "And your father will need to cooperate." "He will." She said it with the certainty of someone who had looked her father in the eye at a gate that morning and understood, for the first time, that he was capable of doing the right thing when it was the only option that had any dignity left in it. Marsh gathered his papers. "Get some sleep, both of you." He paused at the study door. "For what it's worth, and I've been practicing law for 23 years, I've rarely seen a case assembled this thoroughly by people who aren't lawyers." He looked at Amelia. "You have a considerable mind, Miss Whitaker." "Thank you," she said. After he left, the study went quiet. Jonathan was still at the desk, looking at the documents they hadn't yet put away. He had the expression of a man who had been in motion for hours and was only now feeling the full weight of what they'd been carrying. "Beaumont is going to find out we filed," he said. "Yes, probably within a day of our submitting. And then he'll move fast, whatever else he has planned. Then we move faster." She started gathering papers. "We have Marsh. We have the documents. We have 3 weeks of evidence that this estate is operating well and its accounts are clean." She looked up. "We have the truth on our side, Jonathan. That's not nothing." He looked at her from across the desk. Tired. Steady. Something in his expression that was open in a way she'd only begun to see in the past week. The version of him that existed when he'd stopped spending all his energy on containing things. "No," he said quietly. "It's not nothing." She set the last folder on the stack. "Go to bed," she said. "We have a great deal to do tomorrow." "We have our wedding on Friday," he said. She'd nearly lost track of that and everything else. She looked at him. "Yes, we do." "I want you to know," he said, very carefully, "that nothing I've learned in the past 3 days has changed what I said at the Harrington gathering." She met his gaze. "I know. I chose right," he said. "I still choose right." The words landed the same way they had the first time, warm and steady and more complicated than they looked on the surface, carrying the weight of a man who didn't say things he didn't mean. "So do I," she said quietly. She picked up the stack of folders and walked to the door. She stopped. "Jonathan." "Yes." "Whatever Beaumont does next." She turned to look at him. "We face it together. Not me running to Whitaker alone. Not you handling the lawyers while I manage the household. Together." She held his gaze. "Agreed?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Agreed," he said. She nodded once and went to bed. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't know until morning, was that a rider had arrived at the Beaumont estate 3 hours earlier, carrying a response from Philadelphia. Forsyth's response. And in it, Forsyth had confirmed not only the original document, but something else. Something her father hadn't known to tell her, because he hadn't known it himself. There was a second letter. One that Forsyth had written to Thomas Whitaker 2 years ago and never sent, because he'd changed his mind about the terms. A letter that, in the wrong hands, read very differently than it had been intended. Beaumont now had it. And Beaumont, unlike Forsyth, had no intention of keeping it unsent. The letter arrived Friday morning, their wedding day. Mrs. Holt brought it to Amelia's room at 7, before anyone else was fully up, with an expression that told Amelia everything she needed to know about its contents before she opened it. Mrs. Holt had been intercepting correspondence at Caldwell Ridge for 12 years. She knew what a weapon looked like when it arrived in an envelope. Amelia opened it standing up. It was not from Beaumont directly. It was from his attorney. Formal, precise, the language of a man who had been paid to make something ugly sound procedural. The letter stated that his client was in possession of a document written by Gerald Forsyth of Philadelphia, addressed to Thomas Whitaker, dated 2 years prior, in which Forsyth made reference to a sum of money paid to Thomas Whitaker as the word used was inducement, to prioritize the marital arrangement over any other offers that might be made for his daughter Amelia. She read that sentence 3 times. An inducement. Her father had been paid. Not just loaned money with a marital clause attached. Paid, separately, additionally, to ensure she was the one delivered to Forsyth's nephew, which meant the arrangement hadn't been a contingency of desperation. It had been a negotiation. Her father had sat across from a man and discussed her value and accepted money for it. She stood in her room on her wedding morning and held that knowledge in both hands and breathed through it. The letter went on to state that Beaumont's client intended to present this document at the county courthouse on Monday, together with a formal challenge to the validity of the Caldwell-Whitaker union on grounds of prior contractual obligation, and that he advised all parties to consider a settlement before that date. She folded the letter. She did not cry. She had done her crying years ago, she'd told herself on the night she'd left her father's house. She'd meant it then. She meant it more now. What she felt was not grief. It was something colder and more purposeful than grief. It was the feeling she got when a problem had finally shown her its full shape, when all the pieces she'd been holding separately suddenly arranged themselves into a complete picture, and she could see, clearly and without obstruction, exactly what needed to be done. She dressed. She went downstairs. She found Jonathan in the study. He looked at her face and stood up. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it once, just once. When he looked up, his expression was the stillest she'd ever seen it, the absolute stillness of a man whose anger had gone past the temperature where it showed on the outside. "Your father," he said, very quietly. "Yes." He knew about the inducement payment. He must have. She kept her voice level. "He didn't tell me. Whether that was shame or calculation, I can't say." Jonathan set the letter down on the desk with the careful precision of a man who was being very deliberate about every physical movement he made. "It doesn't change anything," he said. She looked at him. "It changes what Beaumont can argue in court." "I'm not talking about the court." His eyes came to hers and stayed there. "I'm talking about us. About what I said at the Harrington gathering. About what I told you in this room 2 nights ago." He held her gaze with absolute steadiness. "None of that changes." She absorbed that. Let it settle. "All right," she said. "All right." He picked the letter back up. "Where is Marsh?" "Still at the inn in town. He said he'd be here by 9 for the ceremony." Jonathan looked at the letter. "I'm going to ride in now and get him. We need to talk before the ceremony." He paused. "Can you reach your father this morning?" She'd been thinking about that. "I can send a rider." "Do it. I need him here today." She looked at him sharply. "Why?" "Because this ends today," Jonathan said. "Not Monday in a courtroom, today." His voice was not raised. It never needed to be raised. "Beaumont wants to walk into a courthouse on Monday and make this as public and damaging as possible. We're not going to give him Monday." She understood what he was proposing before he finished saying it. "You want to force the confrontation now," she said. "On our terms, before he's ready." "I want to take away every piece of ground he thinks he's standing on," Jonathan said. "And I want to do it in front of people who matter in this county, while we still have the initiative." He looked at her. "We have a wedding this morning. Half the county will be at that ceremony." "Half the county," she said slowly, "including, if I know Richard Beaumont himself." "He was invited 3 weeks ago," Jonathan said. "Before any of this. He accepted." Amelia thought about that. Beaumont, who had been playing a long, careful game for 6 years, who had filed a petition and found a damaging document and was counting on Monday to deliver his killing blow. Beaumont did not know that they had spent the last 2 days with a lawyer, that they had filed first, that they had documentation that voided his entire argument. He was coming to a wedding this morning, believing he held all the cards. How was coming to a wedding this morning, not knowing they'd already changed the game. "Send the rider for Marsh," she said. "I'll write to my father." Jonathan was already moving to the door. He stopped. "Amelia." He turned. "I know what you're feeling right now about your father." She said nothing. "Whatever he did, whatever he agreed to, he wrote to warn you. He gave you the documents. He sent you back with everything you needed." He paused. "I'm not excusing it. I'm saying that the question of what he deserves from you is yours to decide, and today is not the day to decide it. His eyes were very steady on hers. Today, you have other things to do. She looked at him for a long moment. Today, I'm getting married, she said. Yes, he said. You are. The Caldwell Ridge ceremony was small by design. The minister, Marsh, Mrs. Holt, Samuel, William standing beside his father with his jaw set and his eyes very bright. The outdoor staff had been given the morning, and most of them had stayed anyway, gathered at a respectful distance, with the particular warmth of people who had watched something come back to life and wanted to be present for the moment it was named. Amelia wore the blue dress the dressmaker had made. Not the finest thing in the room, not trying to be. She wore it like herself, which was the only way she knew how to wear anything. Jonathan stood at the front of the parlor and watched her come in, and the look on his face was not the performance of admiration. It was something plainer and more permanent than admiration. It was the look of a man who had made a decision he was certain of. She stood beside him. The minister began, and Amelia Whittaker, who had been handed over like a debt being settled and had arrived at a strange house with a small bag and 2 books and a mind full of problems she already knew how to solve, stood in the parlor of Caldwell Ridge on a Friday morning in August 1817, and became, in the eyes of Virginia law and God and the small company of people who had come to matter to her, Jonathan Caldwell's wife. When it was done, William shook her hand with great seriousness. "Welcome to the family," he said, the same way he might announce a formal resolution. She pressed her lips together hard. "Thank you, William." "I already thought of you as family," he added, in a slightly lower voice. "But now it's official." She pulled him into a brief hug before he could decide whether he wanted one, and he went stiff with surprise, and then, after a moment, didn't. Richard Beaumont arrived at 11. He came with his wife and his attorney. That last detail noted by Marsh, who said nothing but whose eyes sharpened visibly when he saw the attorney step down from the carriage. Bringing your lawyer to a wedding was not a social call. Amelia watched Beaumont come through the door from across the room. She watched him scan the gathering with those assessing eyes, watched him locate Jonathan, watched him find Marsh. And there, the briefest hesitation. Man recalculating. He didn't know what Marsh was doing here. He would figure it out very quickly. Jonathan met Beaumont in the center of the room before Beaumont could position himself advantageously. That was deliberate. She'd watched Jonathan do it with full awareness of what he was doing. "Richard." Jonathan extended his hand. Beaumont shook it. "Congratulations, Jonathan. Mrs. Caldwell." He turned the last 2 words toward Amelia with a smile that didn't reach anything behind it. "I understand congratulations are very much in order." "They are," she said pleasantly. "Thank you for coming." "I was glad to." He glanced toward Marsh. "I didn't realize you'd have your attorney present." "Daniel is an old friend," Jonathan said. "He was in the area." Beaumont's smile stayed exactly where it was. "How convenient." "Isn't it?" Jonathan agreed. A pause in which both men understood each other perfectly and said nothing about it. Then Beaumont said, in a lower voice that was meant to be private, but that Amelia, standing 2 feet away, heard without difficulty. "Jonathan, I sent a communication this morning that you may find uncomfortable. I want you to know that nothing in it reflects any personal animosity. It's simply a matter of—" "Legal obligation?" Jonathan said. Beaumont's eyes moved. "Business. Then we can discuss it as business," Jonathan said. "After we've eaten. There are people here who'd like to speak with you, Richard. Enjoy the morning." He steered Beaumont gently but unmistakably away, and Amelia turned to find Marsh at her elbow. "He brought his attorney," Marsh said quietly. "I saw. He's going to try to present that letter today. Here, in front of your guests." Marsh's voice was low and even. "He's not waiting until Monday." He saw the gathering as the opportunity, not the courthouse. She'd suspected this. She'd been thinking about it since Jonathan had said today ends today. "Then we move first," she said. "Now, before he finds his moment." Marsh looked at her. "Are you certain?" "I've been certain since 7 this morning," she said. "Get Jonathan." It happened in the dining room, which held most of the gathering, with the easy comfort of people who had eaten and were settled into the warm middle hour of a celebration. Margaret Harrington was there. 3 county landowners whose opinions carried weight. The minister. 2 of Jonathan's business associates who had come from town. Millicent Voss, who had come because she never missed anything important, and had apparently decided that the Harrington gathering required a follow-up. And Richard Beaumont, who had been working his way toward a position near the center of the room with the patience of a man who had been choosing his moments for 6 years. Jonathan stepped forward first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quality of his presence, the absolute, unhurried certainty of it, was enough to draw the room's attention the way a struck bell drew silence. "Before this gathering moves on," he said, "there's a matter I want to address while we're all together. Some of you are aware that there's been a legal dispute over the eastern boundary of Caldwell Ridge. Others may have heard, or will shortly hear, claims about the circumstances of my marriage." He looked directly at Beaumont. "I'd rather deal with both in the open than allow them to circulate as rumor." The room had gone very still. Beaumont's expression had not changed, but his attorney, standing at his shoulder, had shifted his weight. Jonathan looked at Marsh. "Daniel." Marsh stepped forward and, in the clear, factual voice of a man who had spent 3 decades making complex things comprehensible to rooms full of people, laid it out. The boundary petition, the field book, the county register notation and its provenance, including the connection to Marcus Webb and his nephew Carter Beaumont, which he stated as documented fact without editorial. The filing they had submitted to the county court the previous afternoon, establishing their position before any counter-petition could be heard. The room listened. Amelia watched Beaumont's face while Marsh spoke. She watched the moment he understood that the field book existed. She watched the moment he understood about the notation and its documented connection to his own family. She watched the moment he understood that they had filed first. He was very good. His face barely moved, but he was recalculating fast, and she could see it. When Marsh finished, Jonathan said, "There is also a second matter. Mr. Beaumont's attorney sent a letter this morning alleging a prior contractual obligation that would invalidate my marriage. I want to address that directly." Amelia stepped forward. She had not planned to speak. Jonathan had not asked her to. But she stepped forward because this was her life being contested, and she was not willing to stand at the edge of it while someone else defended it for her. "The document Mr. Beaumont obtained from Gerald Forsyth of Philadelphia," she said, and her voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the room, "contains a conditional marital clause that was triggered 2 years ago. Mr. Beaumont has represented this as an active prior obligation." She paused. "It is not. The clause required formal invocation within 6 months of the trigger date. No such invocation occurred within that window. The clause is legally void under Virginia contract law, as Mr. Marsh has confirmed, and as we have documented in a sworn statement filed yesterday alongside our boundary petition." The room was absolutely quiet. "Additionally," she continued, "the letter alleges a separate payment, described as an inducement, made to my father in connection with this arrangement. I want to address that plainly." She looked at Beaumont directly. "My father made decisions in desperation that he regrets. Those decisions do not constitute a valid legal claim against my marriage. They constitute a private family matter that Mr. Beaumont obtained through paid correspondence and chose to deploy as a weapon." She didn't look away from him. "That tells the people in this room something about the nature of this dispute. I'll let them draw their own conclusions." The silence held for another moment. Then Margaret Harrington said, in the carrying voice of a woman who had run county society for 30 years and was making a decision about it in real time, "Well, that seems quite clear." Several people around her murmured agreement. Beaumont stepped forward. His voice was controlled and his smile was back, the wide, confident smile of a man who had one more card. "The invocation question is a matter for the court to decide," he said, addressing the room rather than Amelia. "And the payment, whatever its legal standing, speaks to the circumstances under which this marriage was arranged. The county court will hear all of this on Monday. The county court, Marsh said calmly, has already received our filing. The hearing on the boundary petition has been scheduled for 3 weeks' time. Any challenge to the marriage on the grounds described in your letter this morning will be filed as a counterclaim and heard at the same time. He paused. At which point the court will also receive documentation regarding the 1811 notation in the county register, its author, its timing, and its relationship to the Beaumont family. The color in Beaumont's face shifted, just slightly. You can't prove, he began. We can prove the notation exists, Marsh said. We can prove who added it and when. We can prove your brother-in-law, your family's man, was the county recorder who entered it. What the court makes of that is, as you say, a matter for the court to decide. The room was watching Beaumont now, not with hostility exactly, but with the particular attention of people who had trusted a man and were reassessing that trust in real time. Beaumont's attorney leaned close and said something in his ear. Beaumont looked at him, then at Jonathan. Then, for just a moment, at Amelia. She looked back at him without flinching. He turned and walked out of the room. His attorney followed. His wife, who had stood throughout this entire exchange, with the expression of a woman who was extremely tired of the life she'd married into, took a breath and followed them both. The room let out a collective exhale. Then Margaret Harrington began to clap. It was not a grand theatrical gesture. It was the simple, decided clap of a woman who had seen something she approved of and was saying so. 3 other people joined her immediately. Then more. Jonathan came to stand beside Amelia. He didn't say anything. He simply stood beside her, his shoulder touching hers, and let the room see them together. Her father arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Jonathan had sent for him, and he had come, and he stood in the front hall of Caldwell Ridge, with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had driven for several hours with his decisions keeping him company. Amelia met him alone in the parlor. She'd asked Jonathan for that, and he'd agreed without argument. Her father looked around the room. At the remnants of the gathering, flowers on the mantel, cups still on the side table. I missed the ceremony, he said. Yes. He looked at her. You married him. This morning. He nodded slowly. The hat turned in his hands. I got your letter. You found the invocation clause. Yes. I didn't know about that. He met her eyes. I want you to know I genuinely didn't understand the legal mechanism. When Beaumont's attorney wrote to me, I thought... He stopped. Father. She kept her voice even. The inducement payment, the separate payment from Forsyth. He went very still. Tell me the truth of it, she said. All of it, right now. A long silence. He offered it, her father said finally. I didn't ask for it. He offered it as additional security, his word, that the arrangement would be honored. I accepted it because I was... He stopped again. Because you were frightened, she said. Yes. And because accepting it was easier than telling him no. Her father looked at the floor. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. The full weight of it. Not just the desperation she'd already forgiven. The separate thing. The additional thing. The thing that made it less about survival and more about convenience. Did you think about what it meant? She asked. What it said about how you valued me? Her father's eyes came back to hers, and in them was something she had rarely seen there in her entire life. Not shame performed, not discomfort managed, but the raw, genuine knowledge of what he'd done. No, he said quietly. I didn't think about it the way I should have. I told myself it was for the family. I told myself you'd be cared for. His voice was rough. I didn't think about what it said. I should have. The room was very quiet. Amelia looked at her father's face, worn and old in the morning light, the face of a man who had spent his life managing problems, he created by trying to manage problems, and felt something in herself that was neither forgiveness nor its absence. Something more complicated. The recognition that a person could love you imperfectly and still do you genuine harm. That those two things could be true at the same time without canceling each other out. The loan from Forsyth, she said. $240 outstanding. He nodded. "I'm going to pay it," she said. He stared at her. "Amelia, from the recovered documentation of Pierce's fraud against Caldwell Ridge," she said. "Jonathan and I have discussed it. The amount Pierce took from this estate is enough to cover what's owed to Forsyth and close the obligation completely. When Forsyth receives payment in full, whatever document Beaumont obtained from him loses its only remaining leverage." She held her father's gaze. "The debt is paid. The arrangement is void. The document is worthless." Her father was looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Like all the years of looking past her had been a fog and it had just cleared. "You're doing this," he said. "Not quite a question. You're cleaning up what I'm protecting my family," she said. "This is my family now. What threatens it, I deal with." She stood. "But father, I need you to hear me say this plainly." He looked at her. "I am not doing this for you," she said. "I'm doing it because it's the right solution to a problem. What you did, the arrangement, the payment. I understand why. I even understand the fear behind it. But understanding it is not the same as accepting it as something that should have been done." She held his gaze. "You used me to solve a problem. You didn't see me clearly enough to understand what you were using." She paused. "I see myself clearly. I need you to start doing the same." Her father's jaw worked. For a moment she thought he was going to defend himself. Instead he said, very quietly, "You're right. I'm sorry, Amelia." Not, "I'm sorry you feel that way." Not, "I did my best." Just, "I'm sorry." It was, she thought, the most honest thing he'd said to her in 25 years. She nodded once. "Thank you." She moved toward the parlor door. Then she stopped. "Come and have something to eat," she said. "Mrs. Holt made enough for twice the gathering. Jonathan wants to speak with you about the Forsyth payment." She paused. "And William wants to meet his grandfather." Her father looked up. Something moved through his face that was too complicated to name. Grief and relief, and something that might, given time, become repair. "All right," he said. She held the door open. He walked through it. The afternoon settled into the quieter register that follows days of sustained intensity. The remaining guests left in ones and twos. Marsh rode back to his inn to begin the formal paperwork. Mrs. Holt directed the cleanup of the gathering with the efficient authority of a woman who had been waiting for a household to manage properly for years. Thomas Whitaker sat at the dining table with William, who had decided within approximately 4 minutes that his grandfather was a man worth talking to, and had been asking him questions about the old Whitaker land, with the relentless curiosity of a child who considered all adults useful sources of information. Amelia watched this from the doorway for a moment. Then she went to find Jonathan, who was outside, near the east fence. The fence she'd noticed on her first day, with its leaning posts and broken rails, which Samuel had repaired 3 weeks ago. He was standing where the new posts were, looking out at the field beyond. She came and stood beside him. They were quiet for a moment. "It went well," he said. "It went better than it might have," she said. "Beaumont won't recover from this easily. The county heard everything. His attorney knows the boundary case is compromised." He paused. "He'll be cautious for a long time." "Men like Beaumont are always looking for another angle," she said. "But we'll be ready." He turned to look at her. "We," he said. "We," she confirmed. Something in his face, the last remaining tension of the day, the weight of every hour since the letter had arrived that morning, finally released. Not dramatically, just the quiet settling of a man who had stopped bracing for the next thing because the next thing had been handled. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Then tell me." He looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention that she had come to understand was not coldness at all, had never been coldness. It was the quality of a man who, when he looked at you, was fully present. "When Eleanor died," he said, "I made a decision. Not consciously, not deliberately, but I made it. I decided that the kind of life we'd had, the kind that required me to open myself to another person, was a kind of life I was done with. It hurt too much when it was taken." He paused. "I told myself that what I needed was a practical arrangement. Someone capable. Someone who would run the household and not expect things from me that I couldn't give. He held her gaze. I was wrong about what I needed. She waited. I needed exactly what you are, he said, which is not a practical arrangement. You are someone who walked into a failing household and saw everything that needed doing, and did it without asking permission or waiting for credit. You protected my son. You protected my estate. You stood in a room full of people today and spoke the truth in your own voice without anyone telling you to. He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them to something that was not accidental. You have been doing that every single day since you arrived, and I have been watching you and thinking that I did not deserve to have found someone like you. She looked up at him. You didn't find me, she said. You chose me. Yes, he said. I did. Then deserve it, she said simply. That's all. Just deserve it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not quickly, not impulsively, but the way Jonathan Caldwell did everything that mattered. Deliberately. Certain of it. I intend to, he said. The last of the day faded over the Virginia hills with the particular quality of August evenings. Long and golden and warm enough that you wanted to stay in it. William had gone inside an hour ago. Thomas Whitaker had started the drive back to Whitaker, quieter than he'd arrived, with the look of a man who had some things to think about and was prepared to think about them honestly for perhaps the first time. Mrs. Holt had closed up the kitchen. Samuel had finished the evening round of the fields and reported, by way of a brief knock and a nod at the back door, that the north pasture was holding and the south grain bin was fully repaired and ready. The estate was quiet in the way that only a well-run place could be quiet. Not empty, not neglected, simply at rest. Amelia sat in the study with her notebook open and her pen in her hand, and the orderly satisfaction of a woman who had worked through everything on the current page and was ready to open a new one. Jonathan came in and set a cup of tea beside her without being asked, which was a small thing, and which she thought might be the most quietly significant thing he had done for her yet. He sat in the chair across the desk. She looked up at him. What are you writing? He said. The list for next week, she said. The county court preparation, the Forsyth payment letter, the Northfield rotation for the fall, the 2 new farmhands starting Monday. I need to talk to Samuel about where to put them. She looked at her notes. And William mentioned the roof on the grain house has a soft section. I want to look at that before the rains. Jonathan looked at her for a moment. You have a list that starts with a county court case and ends with a roof, he said. In order of urgency, she said. Right. She looked at him. He was watching her with that particular expression, the one that had no name she'd found yet, but that she understood meant something steady and permanent was happening behind it. Jonathan, she said. I'm happy here. She said it simply, without preamble or qualification, because it was true, and she had spent enough of her life not saying true things directly. Howe was quiet for a moment. His hands were still on the arms of the chair, his eyes on hers. Good, he said. Quiet and certain, and waited with everything he'd told her by the fence. She looked back at her notebook. The roof, she said. I'll look at it Thursday. I'll come with you, he said. You don't know anything about roofs. No, he said. But I know something about not missing things that need my attention. She looked up. Howe was watching her with the hint of something that on another face might have been lightness. On his face was simply the particular warmth of a man who had learned, slowly, and at some cost, how to let a thing matter to him. She turned back to her notebook and wrote roof, Thursday, and underlined it. Outside, the last of the August light moved across the Virginia fields, across the repaired fence and the recovered garden, the well-managed grain stores, the north pasture holding strong, and settled over Caldwell Ridge with the easy confidence of something that had come home. Amelia Whitaker, who had been handed over like a debt and had arrived like a quiet storm, who had walked into a failing household with a small bag and 2 books and more competence than anyone had thought to look for. She had not been saved. She had never needed saving. She had needed a place willing to see her clearly. And now she had one. She had built one. and she was never, not for a single day, invisible again.